She danced with a stranger at her friend's wedding, not knowing who he really was. That moment changed everything when she discovered the millionaire was in love with her. Where are you watching this story from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like because the fate of this dance will surprise you. The sapphire blue dress spun beneath the golden lights of the grand ballroom at the inn at Middleton Place in Charleston, like it had a life of its own, as if the fabric had waited its entire existence for this precise instant. Winifred Hayes had abandoned her silver heels an hour ago, hidden beneath the appetizer table laden with steaming she-crab soup shooters and hand-carved country ham, because the pain in her feet had become unbearable. But now, with her bare soles gliding across the polished hardwood floor that had witnessed centuries of footsteps, she felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since her childhood on the cobblestone streets of the historic district. Her hands, marked by 1,000 needle pricks and years of ceaseless work, now rested between the firm but gentle palms of a stranger who had invited her to dance when the swing music began to play. Winifred couldn't remember the last time she'd danced with someone, perhaps at her cousin's wedding 7 years ago, or maybe never like this, with her heart pounding not from physical exertion but from something deeper she didn't dare name. The man's name was Thaddeus. She'd heard him mention it when he introduced himself with an old-fashioned bow that made her smile. He had dark hair peppered with some premature silver at the temples, eyes the color of autumn chestnuts, and a grey suit that seemed to have been cut specifically for his body by some tailor on Fifth Avenue. But it wasn't the clothes that captivated her. It was the way he looked at her, as if she were the only person in that ballroom filled with elegant guests drinking champagne and discussing their vacations in Martha's Vineyard. "You have beautiful hands," he said, as they turned to the music's rhythm, his voice a warm whisper with a slight southern accent that danced between syllables. Winifred let out a brief, almost bitter laugh. "They're full of calluses and scars. I don't think anyone's ever called them beautiful." "Then the world is full of blind people," Thaddeus responded, and his fingers gently traced the hardened grooves of her palms. "These hands tell stories. Working hands are hands that live." She wanted to look away, to hide the evidence of her 3 simultaneous jobs. The embroidery workshop where she spent 10 hours daily hunched over quilts and wedding veils, the office desks she scrubbed at night until her knees protested, the pralines and biscuits she baked every weekend to sell at the city market. But something in the intensity of those chestnut eyes kept her anchored, present, unable to flee to the usual refuge of her self-loathing. "What's your story?" he asked when the music slowed and their bodies drew imperceptibly closer. "It's not very interesting." "Let me be the judge of that." Winifred swallowed. Nobody asked her questions. Her clients wanted perfect embroidery. Her bosses wanted gleaming floors. The buyers at the market wanted crispy treats. But nobody, absolutely nobody, wanted to know who she was beyond what her hands could produce. "I'm an embroiderer," she began, testing the waters, "at a small workshop near St. Philip's Church. I also clean offices at night and sell baked goods on weekends." She expected to see in his face the expression she knew too well, that mixture of pity and distance that comfortable people reserved for those struggling to survive. But Thaddeus only nodded, genuinely interested. "And when was the last time you rested?" The question hit her with the force of a long-avoided truth. Winifred blinked, trying to remember a day without 5 a.m. alarms, without needles between her fingers, without the smell of bleach permeating her clothes. She found none. "I don't remember," she finally admitted, and her voice broke almost imperceptibly. Thaddeus said nothing. He simply held her closer as the swing music reached its end, as if with that embrace he could protect her from all the exhaustion accumulated in her 42 years of life. And for one fleeting moment, surrounded by the scent of jasmine coming through the open windows and the murmur of other people's conversations, Winifred allowed herself to imagine she deserved to be held like this. The music ended. Applause filled the ballroom. And when their eyes met one last time before separating, Winifred saw something in that stranger's eyes that would haunt her for weeks. A silent promise, a mutual recognition between 2 souls that had learned to hide from the world, but who, for one fugitive instant, had chosen to show themselves. She didn't know then that this man in an impeccable suit and shy smile held secrets capable of transforming her life forever. She couldn't imagine that what began as a casual dance at her best friend's wedding would become the start of an 8-month journey filled with discoveries, pain, overcoming, and a love that would teach her she had always deserved much more than she ever dared believe. But that night, as she collected her abandoned shoes and said goodbye to Beatrice with a hug full of promises of seeing each other soon, Winifred Hayes wasn't thinking about the future. She was thinking only of the warmth of hands that had touched hers without revulsion, of a voice that had asked when she last rested, of eyes that had seen her, truly seen her, for the first time in years. And when she walked alone through Charleston's historic streets under a star-speckled sky, with aching feet and an inexplicably light heart, she whispered to herself a truth she didn't know she needed to hear. Perhaps there's still hope. The ancient stones absorbed her words, keeping them as they had kept so many other nocturnal confessions throughout the centuries. And somewhere in the city, a man named Thaddeus looked out the window of his room at the inn, thinking about a woman in a blue dress who danced barefoot and had the most beautiful hands he'd ever seen. 3 weeks, 21 days, 504 hours. Winifred had counted every one of them, while trying to convince herself that the wedding night had been just that, a night, an unreal parenthesis in the monotony of her existence. Like Cinderella at the ball, she thought, while plunging the needle into the black velvet of a mourning veil, knowing that poor girls from Charleston didn't end up with princes. Fairy tales were beautiful lies told to make reality more bearable. Mrs. Constance's embroidery workshop occupied the first floor of a centuries-old building on Church Street, so close to St. Philip's that the sound of bells marked the rhythm of their days. It was a small space, crowded with fabrics of every color, spools of gold and silver thread, half-dressed mannequins, and the perpetual aroma of starch and reheated coffee. Winifred worked alongside 3 other embroiderers, Dorothy, Pearl, and young Hope, under the supervision of Constance, a 70-year-old widow with arthritic fingers that could no longer hold a needle, but whose eyes detected every imperfect stitch from yards away. That October morning, the sky over Charleston threatened rain. The clouds dragged heavily over the terracotta rooftops, and the wind entering through the half-open window brought the smell of wet stone and autumn leaves. Winifred was concentrating on embroidering a particularly intricate rosette when the doorbell chimed. "Good morning," said a voice that made her fingers stop cold. "I need a shirt adjusted." She raised her eyes slowly, as if afraid that doing it too quickly would make the mirage vanish. But there he was, Thaddeus with a white linen shirt folded over his arm and that shy smile that had populated her dreams for 3 weeks. "You," Winifred began, but the words stuck in her throat. "Sorry for the intrusion," he said, approaching the counter where she worked. "They told me this place does the best alterations in Charleston, and it turns out this shirt has a problem with the collar." Dorothy and Pearl exchanged glances loaded with curiosity from their workstations. Mrs. Constance, who observed everything from her chair by the window, narrowed her eyes with suspicion. Hope, the youngest, stifled a giggle behind her fabric. Winifred took the shirt with hands she tried to keep steady. She examined it briefly. The linen was of a quality she rarely touched, soft as a caress, probably imported from Italy or southern France, and the collar was perfectly fine. "I don't see any problem," she said, returning the garment. Thaddeus had the decency to blush slightly. "Perhaps I was mistaken. Could you examine it more carefully?" "Sir, this shirt has no defect." "Then perhaps I need something else," he responded, and his eyes sought hers with an intensity that left her breathless. "A coffee, for example. I know a place near here that serves the best beignets in the city." The silence that followed was so dense that Winifred could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She felt her co-workers' gazes fixed on her back, Constance's silent evaluation, the weight of all the expectations and prejudices she'd carried for years. "I have work," she said finally, though every fiber of her being wanted to say yes. "I know," Thaddeus responded. "That's why I'm asking. Everyone deserves a break from time to time, don't you think?" Winifred remembered his question during the dance. When was the last time you rested? And she also remembered how she'd felt in his arms, seen and valued for the first time in years. "I have half an hour for lunch," she heard her own voice say, surprising herself. "At 2 o'clock. Thaddeus's smile illuminated his face like the sun emerging behind storm clouds. 2 o'clock, then. I'll wait outside." When the bell chimed announcing his departure, Dorothy was the first to break the silence. "Good Lord, Winifred, who was that?" "An acquaintance," she responded, returning to her embroidery with fingers that now trembled. "From Beatrice's wedding." "Well, that acquaintance looks at you like you're the Holy Mother descended from heaven," Pearl commented with a mischievous smile. "Don't be silly." But as she plunged the needle into the velvet, Winifred couldn't help a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. And when the church bells marked 2 in the afternoon, she removed her apron with a haste she hadn't felt since her youth, smoothed the folds of her simple skirt, and went out to meet a man holding a black umbrella beneath Charleston's first autumn rain. They walked together through the narrow streets, him holding the umbrella over both of them, her trying to maintain a certain distance that their bodies seemed determined to reduce. They talked about small things, the changing weather, the shops that closed and opened, the smell of incense escaping from the nearby church. And when they reached the tiny cafe hidden in an alley that Winifred didn't know, despite her years in the city, they sat at a table by the window, fogged with the steam of hot chocolate. "Why did you come?" she asked while dipping a beignet in the dark foam. "Really?" Thaddeus looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. And believe me, I tried. You don't know me. Then let me know you." Winifred set the beignet on the plate. The chocolate formed patterns on the white porcelain, tiny rivers that slowly cooled. "I'm a 42-year-old embroiderer who works 3 jobs to pay the rent on an apartment that barely deserves that name, and the care of a sick mother in a nursing home in Colombia. I have no savings, no property, no future beyond the next rent payment. I'm not interesting or special or anything that deserves the attention of someone like you. Someone like me. Someone who wears designer clothes and carries watches that probably cost more than everything I'll earn in a year." Thaddeus didn't deny anything. He just looked at her with those chestnut eyes that seemed to see beyond her words, beyond her defenses, beyond the armor of self-loathing she'd built over decades. "What if I told you I have my own burdens too? That money doesn't buy peace or fill the voids one carries inside. I'd say those are problems I'd prefer to have." "Perhaps," he conceded, "but problems aren't measured in dollars. They're measured in sleepless nights, in silences that weigh heavy, in the certainty of not knowing if someone loves you for who you are or for what you represent." Something in his voice, a crack of vulnerability showing beneath the polished surface, made Winifred pause. For the first time she looked beyond the impeccable suit and expensive watch. She saw the shadows under his eyes, the almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously on the table. "What do you want from me?" she asked, and her voice had softened without her deciding it. "Time," Thaddeus responded. "Just that. Time to know you, for you to know me. Without expectations or promises. Just 2 people sharing beignets while the rain falls on Charleston." Winifred looked out the window. The drops slid down the glass like crystal tears, distorting the silhouettes of pedestrians running for shelter. And in that moment, surrounded by the aroma of cocoa and cinnamon, with the voice of that strange man resonating in her ears, she made a decision that would change the course of her life. "All right," she said, "time." And when their gazes met over the steaming cups of chocolate, both knew that something had begun. Something fragile and precious like the first buds of spring emerging through cracks in the pavement. Something that deserved the chance to grow. Autumn advanced over Charleston, painting the magnolias gold and ochre, while Thaddeus became inexplicably part of Winifred's routine. He arrived at the embroidery workshop every Tuesday and Friday with some transparent excuse. A loose button he'd clearly pulled off himself, a hem that needed adjustment, a tie requiring specialized cleaning. The other embroiderers had stopped hiding their complicit smiles, and even the severe Mrs. Constance had softened her expression when he entered with his old-fashioned bow and melodious good mornings. But it was after work when the magic happened. Thaddeus waited for her to finish her shift, sometimes until 9 at night when orders piled up, and they walked together through the cobblestone streets beneath the starry South Carolina sky. He talked to her about books he'd read, places he'd visited, movies that had moved him. She, timidly at first, shared stories of her childhood in the Cannonboro neighborhood. Of her mother who had taught her to embroider when she was barely 7 years old. Of the dreams she'd buried so deeply, she'd almost forgotten them. One November night, while sharing plates of shrimp and grits at a tiny tavern near Waterfront Park, Thaddeus asked for the first time about her father. "He left when I was 12, Winifred responded, surprising herself at how easily the words came. "He simply disappeared one morning. Left a note saying he wasn't made for this life. We never knew what life he was looking for." "Did you hate him?" "For years," she admitted. "But hate weighs too much. In the end, I let it go because carrying it was destroying me." Thaddeus nodded slowly, as if those words resonated with something deep inside him. "My mother's been married 4 times, he said, and it was the first time he'd spoken of his family. Each husband was a step toward something more. More money, more prestige, more power. I've never known if she ever truly loved someone or if love was just another transaction for her." "And your father?" "The second husband. A cold man who saw me as an obligation, not a son. He died when I was 20. I didn't cry at his funeral. I think that says more about our relationship than any words could." Winifred extended her hand across the table and touched his. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but loaded with an understanding that transcended the differences between their worlds. Both knew the loneliness that comes from growing up feeling invisible, not loved, only tolerated. "We're 2 orphans of living parents," she murmured. "Or living people who learn to survive without them," he responded, intertwining his fingers with hers. The following weeks deepened that connection. They watched Tarantino films in Winifred's tiny apartment, cuddled on the worn sofa that had belonged to her grandmother, eating sunflower seeds while commenting on each scene. He accompanied her one rainy afternoon to visit her mother at the nursing home in Colombia, and listened patiently to the repeated stories of an old woman whose memory was unraveling like sand between fingers, never showing discomfort or haste. She waited for him one night outside a business meeting in Atlanta. He never told her exactly what it was about, and they had tapas at a bar near Centennial Olympic Park while he decompressed the stress with anecdotes about difficult colleagues. But there was something Winifred couldn't ignore. Thaddeus never spoke specifically about his work. "Textiles," he said vaguely when she asked. "Boring company stuff that would put you to sleep if I told you." And she, who had learned not to press, respected his silence. After all, she also had secrets. The growing debt with the nursing home that drowned her each month, the sleepless nights calculating numbers that never added up, the constant fear that one day everything would collapse. The first kiss came one December afternoon, when Charleston was preparing for Christmas, with lights hanging between the old buildings like garlands of stars. Winifred was closing the embroidery workshop, turning off the lights one by one, when she saw his silhouette through the glass, fogged by the cold. He was waiting for her under a black umbrella, though it wasn't raining, with that shy smile that by then she knew better than her own reflection. "What are you doing here?" she asked while locking the door. "It's Tuesday, not Friday." "I couldn't wait until Friday," he simply responded. They walked together through the historic streets, their breaths forming vapor clouds in the frozen air. The stones gleamed wet from recent rain, reflecting the Christmas lights in puddles that seemed like windows to other worlds. And when she stumbled on a loose cobblestone near the illuminated church, he caught her and didn't let go. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant, as if both feared the moment would dissolve if they were too abrupt. Their lips tasted of coffee and promises, of fear and hope intertwined. And when they finally separated, foreheads resting against each other and hearts beating in unison, Winifred felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten its name. "I'm afraid," she whispered against his lips. "Me too," he responded. But perhaps shared fear weighs less. That night, as they walked hand in hand under December's stars, with the smell of wet stone and jasmine filling their lungs, Winifred allowed herself for the first time to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she deserved to be happy. She didn't know then that Thaddeus's secrets would soon come to light. She couldn't imagine that the following weeks would test everything they'd built, but in that moment, with the warmth of his hand piercing the winter cold, none of that mattered. Only the present mattered. and the present was beautiful. 4 months after that wedding in Charleston, the house of cards that Winifred had carefully built, each card representing a small hope, a shared moment, a reason to believe, began to wobble. Thaddeus had invited her to see his house in Asheville. "Nothing special," he'd said with a naturalness she found charming. "I just want you to see where I spend some weekends." She imagined a comfortable apartment near the famous Biltmore estate, perhaps with a view of the Blue Ridge Mountains. She prepared a small suitcase with simple but clean clothes, applied the only perfume she owned, a half-empty bottle of lavender her mother had given her years ago, and climbed into his car with her heart beating with anticipation. The trip from Charleston was pleasant. They crossed North Carolina fields painted spring green, small towns with stone churches and plazas where elderly people sunbathed on iron benches. Thaddeus sang off-key to songs playing on the radio while she laughed, genuinely happy for the first time in years. But when they took a detour down a secondary road lined with centuries-old oaks, something in the air changed. The wrought iron gate appeared first, imposing, decorated with heraldic shields she didn't recognize. Then came the endless driveway, shadows and lights playing on the pavement as they advanced. And finally, like a mirage materializing against all logic, the house. No, it wasn't a house. It was a 3-story manor with a golden stone facade that gleamed under the afternoon sun. Perfectly manicured gardens extending as far as the eye could see, fountains murmuring aquatic melodies, and the snowy silhouette of the Blue Ridge Mountains as a backdrop. The type of property that appeared in magazines Winifred leafed through in dentists' waiting rooms, daydreaming about lives that would never be hers. The car stopped. She didn't move. "Do you work here?" she asked in a strangled voice, desperately searching for an explanation that fit with the image of the man she knew. Thaddeus turned off the engine. His hands remained on the steering wheel for a long time before he turned toward her, and in his eyes Winifred saw something that froze her. Guilt. "I live here," he finally said. "This is my family's house. It's belonged to the Ashworths for 6 generations." The words fell like stones in a tranquil lake, creating ripples that expanded until they reached every corner of her being. Ashworth. The name resonated in her memory, an echo of half-heard conversations, headlines in business newspapers, signs on textile factories throughout the South. "Ashworth Textiles," she whispered, and it wasn't a question. "Yes. You're the heir." "Yes." The silence that followed was so dense that Winifred could hear the birds singing in the gardens, the distant murmur of the fountain, the runaway beating of her own heart breaking into 1,000 pieces. "The veils I embroider," she said slowly, each word an effort. "The fabrics I use in the workshop. Are they from your factories?" "Probably many of them, yes." Winifred closed her eyes. Images overlapped in her mind like contradictory transparencies. Thaddeus sharing beignets in modest cafes, Thaddeus sitting on her worn sofa eating sunflower seeds, Thaddeus holding her sick mother's hand with infinite patience. And now this. Thaddeus, heir to an empire that employed thousands of people like her, people who worked themselves to exhaustion so that families like his could maintain houses like this one. "Why?" was all she could articulate. "Because I've been hurt before," he responded, and his voice broke. "People who only wanted me for the money, for the position, for what they could get from me. When I met you at that wedding, when I saw you dance barefoot because your shoes hurt, when I heard your genuine laugh and saw your working hands, I knew you were different, but I was afraid everything would change if you knew the truth. So you lied to me. I omitted. There's a difference." "No," Winifred said, with a firmness that surprised herself. "There isn't." She opened the car door and got out, her legs trembling as they touched the perfectly raked gravel of the path. The spring breeze brought the scent of wisteria and something else, something metallic she recognized as her own blood pumping pure adrenaline. "Winifred, please." "I need time," she interrupted, turning to look at him. "I need to process this." "Let me explain." "No." Her voice resonated against the centuries-old stones of the facade. "Not now. I can't look at you right now without feeling that everything we built was a lie. It wasn't. It isn't. My feelings for you are real. Perhaps, she conceded bitterly, but mine were based on knowing a man who didn't exist. I need to know who you really are before deciding if I can continue with this. Thaddeus took a step toward her, but stopped when he saw her expression. It was the look of someone who'd been betrayed too many times, who'd learned to protect herself by building walls, and who now felt those walls crumbling without her permission. I'll take you back to Charleston, he offered quietly. No, I'll call Beatrice. She'll come get me. At least let me wait with you until she arrives. Winifred shook her head. The tears she'd contained began to slide down her cheeks, burning against her cold skin. Please, she whispered. Just, please, leave me alone. And he did. Because despite everything, despite the omissions and secrets, Thaddeus Ashworth understood one fundamental thing about love. It's not imposed. It's offered. It's waited for. It's respected. Even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. As the car disappeared down the oak-lined driveway, leaving her alone in front of that mansion representing everything that separated them, Winifred wondered if she would ever trust anyone again. The answer, whispered by the Asheville wind, was a silence that weighed more than any words. 2 weeks, 14 days of absolute silence, in which Winifred submerged herself in work, with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. She embroidered until her fingers bled, leaving small red stains on the fabrics she then had to wash with cold water and vinegar. She scrubbed floors until her knees burned. She baked treats with a contained fury that confused the customers at City Market, who noticed something different in the pecan pies from that woman with an absent gaze. She didn't answer Thaddeus's calls. There were 16 messages in her voicemail that she didn't dare listen to. Beatrice tried to talk to her during a hurried coffee in Marion Square, assuring her that Thaddeus was a good person, that his silence about his identity had been protection, not deception. But Winifred couldn't hear reason. Not yet. The letter arrived on a rainy Tuesday when the sky over Charleston seemed to share her somber mood. It wasn't a digital message, not an email or a WhatsApp with desperate emojis. It was a handwritten letter on cream-colored linen paper, with the elegant but slightly trembling calligraphy she'd learned to recognize in the small notes he used, to leave hidden in her coat pockets. The envelope was sealed with red wax, an old-fashioned detail that made her smile despite herself. She sat on the worn sofa in her apartment, the only witness to the romance that now seemed like a dream, and opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Dear Winifred, I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness because I understand that some wounds need time to heal, and that empty words only make things worse. I'm writing because you need to know my complete truth before deciding if you can forgive me. I grew up in that mansion you saw, surrounded by luxuries others would envy. But the cold of those centuries-old stones got into my bones from a very young age. My mother married and divorced with the ease of someone changing clothes, always seeking the next rung of power, the next convenient husband. My father, the second of her husbands, saw me as a business obligation, an heir who needed to be molded, not a son who deserved love. I learned early that in my world, affection was a transaction, that smiles hid calculations, that every I love you had an attached price. When I turned 25, I fell in love with a woman I thought was different. 3 months later, I discovered she was betting with her friends about how much money she could extract from me before getting bored. She laughed in my face when I confronted her, saying that nobody approaches an Ashworth for anything other than money. Since then, I've lived hidden behind invisible walls. I attend social events the bare minimum necessary. I avoid society magazines like the plague. And when I meet someone new, I test. I wait. I observe. I look for signs that they only see the surname, the bank account, the mansion. And then I saw you, dancing barefoot because your shoes hurt, without caring what others thought, laughing with your friend Beatrice with a joy so genuine it made my chest ache, with hands that told stories of honest work, of struggle, of dignity, and for the first time in years, I felt hope. I didn't hide my identity out of contempt or as a game. I did it because I needed to know if what you felt for me was real before the weight of my surname crushed everything. I was a coward, I know, but fear makes us commit terrible mistakes. What I feel for you has nothing to do with what I own. I love you for how you wrinkle your nose when you concentrate on difficult embroidery. For the stories you tell about your mother with a mixture of sadness and tenderness that breaks my heart. For the way you defend the other embroiderers when Mrs. Constance gets difficult. For your laugh, your silences, your strength. For being exactly who you are. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm only asking you to know this. In my life of empty privileges, you've been the only real thing. And if you leave me, I'll accept it. But not without first telling you that you've changed me, that knowing you has made me want to be a better person, that every moment by your side has been worth more than all the previous years combined. Yours, always and in all ways, Thaddeus. Tears fell on the paper when Winifred finished reading, moistening the ink in some spots, blurring the words but not their meaning. She sat for a long time in the growing penumbra of her apartment, with the letter pressed against her chest, while outside the rain beat against the windows like impatient fingers. She thought about her own father, who had fled without looking back, about her mother, who had loved her with everything she had, but who now didn't recognize her half the days, about the men who had passed briefly through her life, attracted by her youthful beauty, but scared off by her poverty, by her responsibilities, by the burden she represented. And she thought about Thaddeus, about his sad eyes when he talked about his childhood, about the way he listened, really listened, to every word she said, about how he'd held her sick mother's hand for hours without showing impatience, about the kiss under December's rain that tasted of hope. The letter didn't erase the lie, but it explained it. It gave it context, depth, humanity. It showed her a wounded man who had done the only thing he knew to protect himself, even though in doing so, he'd hurt her too. Winifred got up from the sofa. She walked to the window and looked at Charleston's wet streets, the streetlights creating blurry halos in the night mist. She made a decision. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It was something smaller but equally important. It was a door she left ajar, a possibility she refused to extinguish. She took her phone and wrote a single message. I need you to answer something with absolute honesty. Who are you really when nobody's watching? The response arrived 3 minutes later. A scared man who's learning to be brave. Will you let me show you? Winifred closed her eyes. The wall she'd built during 42 years to protect herself from pain showed a crack, small but undeniable, and through that crack, light entered. The reunion happened in neutral territory, a stone bench at Fort Sumter, with a view of Charleston Harbor winding between the islands and the setting sun painting the sky orange and rose. Winifred arrived first. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her heart beating so hard she feared the tourists passing by could hear it. She'd thought a lot about what she'd say, had rehearsed phrases in front of her tiny bathroom mirror, but now all the words mixed in an incoherent whirlwind. When she saw Thaddeus approaching along the cobblestone path, something in her chest loosened. He looked different, thinner, with deeper shadows under his eyes, clothes less impeccable than usual, as if the 2 weeks of separation had affected him as much as her. "Hello," he said, stopping a yard away, respecting a space he didn't dare cross without permission. "Hello," she responded. Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had too much to say and didn't know where to start. "Thank you for coming," he finally offered. "Your letter." Winifred swallowed. "It made me understand some things. But I need more. Thaddeus, I need to know everything. No omissions, no secrets. If we're going to try this, it has to be with cards on the table." He nodded and sat beside her on the bench, maintaining some distance but close enough that she could see every emotion crossing his face. "Ask whatever you want, I'll answer everything." And she asked. For hours, while the sun sank on the horizon and the first stars appeared over Charleston Harbor, Winifred unearthed every corner of that man's life who had burst into hers. She learned about the factories, 15 in total, scattered across Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, and the thousands of workers who depended on them. She learned about board meetings where men in suits discussed numbers without thinking about the people behind each figure. She learned about his constant struggle to modernize operations, to improve conditions, to face a board of directors that only saw profits and margins. She learned about his mother, a woman of icy beauty who collected husbands like others collected art. About his father who never once said, "I love you." About grandmother Eleanor, the only light in his dark childhood, who told him stories about when she herself was poor and washed clothes in the river. About his sister Victoria, who despised him for not fitting the mold the family expected. And she learned about Prudence, the woman who had hurt him with that cruel bet. The name seemed vaguely familiar. Perhaps she'd read it in some gossip magazine. But what mattered was the pain still showing in Thaddeus's eyes when he spoke of her. "Did you love her?" Winifred asked. "I thought I did. Now I know I loved the idea of being loved. They're very different things. And me, do you love me or do you love the idea of me?" Thaddeus turned toward her. The full moon's light illuminated his face, revealing every line, every shadow, every truth. "I love every part of you I know, and I want to know all the ones I'm missing. I love your working hands and your genuine laugh. I love how you refuse to be less than what you are even though the world pressures you. I love your strength, your vulnerability, your stubborn heart that refuses to give up. You're not an idea, Winifred. You're the most real woman I've ever known." She felt tears gathering, but this time they weren't from pain. They were from something more complicated, a mixture of relief, fear, hope, and something that was beginning to look dangerously like love. "I have a condition," she finally said. "Anything. I'm not going to change who I am. If you want me, you'll have to accept the woman who works 3 jobs, who embroiders her own dresses, who takes pride in every callus on her hands. I won't be a pretty accessory in your world. I'll be myself or nothing." The smile that illuminated Thaddeus's face was like dawn after a storm. "I wouldn't want you to be anything else. It's exactly who you are that made me fall in love." "Then let's start again," Winifred proposed, extending her hand. "I'm Winifred Hayes, embroiderer, cleaner, baked goods seller. I'm 42 years old, have too many debts, and a heart that's learning to trust again." He took her hand, and the contact sent electricity through her entire body. "I'm Thaddeus Ashworth, heir to an empire I didn't ask for, fighting to make it better. I'm 45 years old, have too many family secrets, and a heart I thought was dead until I met you." They looked at each other for a long time, 2 lonely figures on a stone bench, while Charleston slept at their feet. And when he leaned in to kiss her, soft and slow like that first time under the rain, Winifred knew she'd made the right decision. It wouldn't be easy. Their worlds were as different as water and oil. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way to mix without losing themselves. That night, as they walked hand in hand through the historic streets, Winifred allowed herself to dream of a future that included that strange and wonderful man. And for the first time in her life, the dream didn't seem impossible. The Ashworth Mansion's dining room could comfortably seat 30 people. That spring night, only 8 sat around the centuries-old oak table, but the tension was enough to fill a stadium. Winifred occupied the seat to Thaddeus's right, wearing the burgundy dress she'd sewn during sleepless nights. It was simple but elegant, designed not to compete with the sparkle of jewels adorning the other women present. Her hands, which she'd tried to soften with creams for a week, rested on the embroidered linen tablecloth, probably produced in one of the Ashworth factories, while facing the evaluating gazes of the family. At the head, Mr. Gerald Ashworth, Thaddeus's father, presided over the table with the authority of a general in his barracks. His face was a mask of icy courtesy that didn't reach his grey, calculating eyes. To his right, Mrs. Camilla, Thaddeus's mother in her 4th marriage, displayed pearls probably worth more than everything Winifred would earn in 5 years. But the real threat came from Victoria. Thaddeus's sister, 2 years younger than him, was beautiful in a cutting way. Sharp cheekbones, thin lips, eyes that dissected everything they looked at. Her comments, disguised as casual conversation, carried venom in every syllable. "So you're an embroiderer," she said, while cutting her filet mignon with surgical precision. "How quaint." "It's an ancient and respectable craft," Winifred responded, keeping her voice firm. It requires patience, precision, and many years of practice. Oh, of course. I didn't mean to diminish it. Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. I was just commenting. It's not usual for Thaddeus to bring home his acquaintances. Winifred isn't an acquaintance, Thaddeus intervened firmly. She's my partner. Partner, Mr. Gerald repeated, as if the word left a bitter taste. Interesting choice of vocabulary. It's the correct choice, his son responded. The dinner continued between tense silences and superficial conversations about business. Winifred didn't understand, and social events she'd never attended. Every bite she swallowed tasted like ash, and more than once she had to restrain herself from getting up and fleeing from that table where she clearly wasn't welcome. But then something unexpected happened. "I want to speak with her alone," a voice announced from the opposite end of the table. Everyone turned toward Mrs. Eleanor. Thaddeus's grandmother, with her 89 years and her black lace mantilla, had remained silent during the entire dinner, observing with eyes that saw more than they showed. "Mother, I don't think it's necessary," Mr. Gerald began. "I haven't asked for your opinion, son." The old woman cut him off with an authority that admitted no reply. "Miss Hayes, would you accompany me to the library?" Winifred looked at Thaddeus, who nodded slightly with an expression mixing surprise and hope. She rose from the table with all the dignity she could muster and followed the old woman down a long hallway decorated with portraits of ancestors who looked at her with disapproval from their gilded frames. The library was a sanctuary of silence and paper. Dark wood shelves covered the walls to the ceiling, packed with leather-bound books whose spines gleamed under the dim lamplight. The smell of old paper and beeswax filled the air, mixing with something more subtle, lavender perhaps or rosemary. Mrs. Eleanor sat in a velvet armchair, worn by decades of use, and pointed to the seat across from her. "Sit down, child. My legs aren't what they used to be." Winifred obeyed, crossing her hands in her lap, in a protective gesture she'd developed during years of feeling out of place. "Show me your hands," the old woman requested. Confused but obedient, Winifred extended her palms upward. Mrs. Eleanor took them between hers, which were surprisingly strong for her age, and examined them closely. Her fingers traced the calluses, the small needle-prick scars, the marks of honest work. And then her eyes filled with tears. "Working hands," she murmured. "Like mine before money softened them." "Pardon?" The old woman released a brief laugh that sounded rusty from disuse. "My granddaughter thinks I was born into this wealth. Everyone thinks so. But I came from the poorest neighborhood in Asheville, from a family of washerwomen who worked in the French Broad River until their hands cracked from the cold. I learned to sew and embroider to survive, like you." Winifred looked at her with new eyes, searching for traces of that history beneath the pearls and lace. "I met Thaddeus's grandfather when he had nothing more than a small weaving mill inherited from his father, and many dreams," Mrs. Eleanor continued. "His family opposed the marriage. They said I only wanted his money, that I was an opportunist. Sounds familiar, doesn't it?" "Very familiar," Winifred admitted. "We built this empire together, working side by side, through the depression and the scarcity that came after. Every brick of this house has some of my sweat, though nobody remembers now. Though my own children have forgotten." The old woman squeezed Winifred's hands with surprising strength. "You remind me of who I was, and you remind my grandson what really matters. Don't let my foolish family drive you away from him." Winifred felt tears burning in her eyes. "It's not easy. They're afraid," Mrs. Eleanor interrupted. "Afraid that a woman like you will show them that all their money and titles mean nothing without humanity. You're a mirror reflecting their emptiness, and that terrifies them. How did you bear it? The years of contempt, of feeling out of place?" The old woman smiled, and for a moment her eyes blazed with youthful fire. "I found allies, people who truly saw me, and I clung to what I knew was true, that my worth didn't depend on the opinion of small people, that genuine love is worth more than 1,000 empty approvals." She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "And one more thing, child. You have something they'll never have. You know what it is to fight. You know what it is to earn every crumb. That strength is indestructible if you don't let them steal it from you. Winifred let the tears fall freely. In that silent library, surrounded by centuries-old books and family secrets, she found something she didn't expect: an ally. An old woman who had walked the same path decades before and had survived to tell about it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs." Eleanor responded with a mischievous smile. "You still have much battle ahead, but now you know you're not alone." When they returned to the dining room, Winifred walked differently, with her back straighter, her gaze firmer, her shoulders freed from the weight of doubt. And when Victoria attempted another of her venomous comments, the old woman silenced her with a single look that spoke of decades of accumulated authority. That night, as Thaddeus accompanied her back to Charleston, Winifred told him about the conversation. He listened in silence, his eyes shining with an emotion that needed no words. "My grandmother is the best person in my family," he finally said. "I always knew it, but now I'm more certain than ever. She gave me hope," Winifred admitted, "and advice not to let them steal my strength." Thaddeus took her hand over the gear shift. "Nobody's going to steal anything from you while I'm by your side." And though she knew the battles were just beginning, Winifred allowed herself to believe that together, with a wise old woman as an ally and a love growing against all odds, they could face anything. The contemporary art exhibition at the High Museum in Atlanta attracted the Southern elite like moths to light. Winifred walked arm in arm with Thaddeus among abstract sculptures and paintings she didn't understand, feeling like an imposter in a world where everyone seemed to speak a secret language of subtle gestures and cultural references she didn't know. But he made her feel less lost. He explained the works patiently, introduced her to acquaintances with genuine pride, never let go of her hand even though some guests' gazes clearly expressed their disapproval. It was as if his presence beside her was a declaration of principles, a silent challenge to his class's expectations. And then Prudence appeared. Winifred recognized her before Thaddeus saw her. Tall, impeccably dressed in a designer suit that probably cost more than her annual rent, with platinum blonde hair falling in perfect waves over shoulders bronzed by Hilton Head sun. She was the kind of beauty that appeared in fashion magazines, polished to the last eyelash, designed to impress. "Thaddeus," she purred, approaching with the confidence of someone who knows exactly the effect she causes. "What a surprise to see you here, and accompanied." Her eyes evaluated Winifred with a coldness that froze blood, stopping at every detail. The simple dress she'd sewn herself, the low-heeled shoes bought on sale, the hands she tried to hide in her coat pockets. "Prudence," Thaddeus greeted with barely perceptible tension. "It's been a while." "Too long, darling, but I see you've been busy." She turned to Winifred with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "We haven't been introduced. I'm Prudence Mendenhall Cunningham. Thaddeus and I were very close a few years ago." "Winifred Hayes," she responded, refusing to show the intimidation she felt. "Pleased to meet you." "Hayes," Prudence repeated as if the common surname confirmed all her suspicions. "What a traditional name." Thaddeus intervened, his voice sharp. "If you'll excuse us, we need to." "Oh, not so fast." Prudence placed a hand with perfectly manicured nails on his arm. "I need to speak with your little friend alone. Girl things, you know." Before Thaddeus could protest, Winifred nodded. She'd learned long ago that fleeing from conflicts only made them grow in the shadows. It was better to face them head-on. "It's all right," she said, releasing his hand. "Give me 5 minutes." She followed Prudence to a deserted museum terrace, where Atlanta's night air brought the smell of car exhaust and jasmine from nearby gardens. The city lights sparkled at their feet like a blanket of fallen stars. "I'll be direct," Prudence began, lighting a cigarette with a gold lighter. "How much do you want?" "Excuse me?" "Money. To disappear with dignity. I can make a transfer tonight if you give me the account number." Winifred looked at her steadily, trying to understand if she was serious. "I don't want your money." "Oh, please." Prudence exhaled smoke with practiced elegance. "Everyone wants something. 500,000, $1 million. Be reasonable. What you have with Thaddeus is a temporary whim, a phase of rebellion against the family. I'm telling you from experience, Men like him eventually return to their world, and when that happens, you won't want to be empty-handed. I'm not with him for money. Of course not. Prudence's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Nobody is. We all say the same thing at first, but listen, darling, I'm doing you a favor. I know the Ashworths. The family will destroy you before allowing you to taint their lineage with your, how to say it nicely, your humble background. Winifred felt rage bubbling inside her, but she contained herself. Losing her temper was exactly what this woman wanted. I appreciate your concern, she said with glacial calm, but I don't need it. So naive, Prudence sighed. Maybe this will convince you then. Did you know that Thaddeus's factories were fined years ago for precarious labor conditions? That workers like you, simple people living from their sweat, were exploited to keep the Ashworth empire standing? The words hit Winifred with the force of an unexpected punch. What? Oh, he didn't tell you. Prudence's smile widened. What a surprise. The Alabama factory, specifically. $1 million fines for lack of safety, abusive hours, misery wages. Your dear Prince Charming inherited an empire built on the backs of people like you. That was years ago. Things change little in these worlds, darling. Old money has a short memory for its own sins and a very long one for others. Think about it. Prudence extinguished her cigarette in a geranium pot and walked away with measured steps, leaving Winifred alone with the weight of a truth she didn't know how to process. When Thaddeus found her minutes later, with reddened eyes but straight back, he knew something had changed. And when she asked him about Alabama, he saw in his face the confirmation of everything Prudence had insinuated. The crack they'd begun to heal reopened that night, deeper than before. The gardens at Fort Sumter were deserted at that afternoon hour. Tourists had sought refuge from the spring heat in nearby cafes, leaving the gravel paths empty under the shade of centuries-old cypresses. Winifred walked beside Thaddeus in a silence loaded with all the questions she didn't dare formulate and all the answers he didn't know how to give. Charleston Harbor gleamed at their feet like a ribbon of molten silver, indifferent to the human dramas unfolding on its shores. I need you to tell me everything, she finally said, stopping in front of a viewpoint offering views of the historic city spread like a tapestry of roofs and towers. Thaddeus breathed deeply. His face, normally controlled, now showed a vulnerability Winifred had only glimpsed on rare occasions. Alabama, he began, and his voice sounded hoarse. 6 years ago we received a surprise audit. Inspectors found irregularities, inadequate ventilation, shifts exceeding legal limits, insufficient protection equipment, $1 million fines, scandals in local press that my father managed to silence before they reached national media. And the workers? Many of them had been that way for years. Women like you, Winifred, hunched over sewing machines 10 hours a day, without adequate breaks, without real rights. The union was a farce controlled by management. Nobody dared complain for fear of losing their job. Winifred felt nausea climbing her throat. She thought about the embroiderers in Mrs. Constance's workshop, about Dorothy's arthritic hands, about Pearl's hunched back. She thought about herself, working 3 jobs to exhaustion just to survive. And what did you do? Nothing, Thaddeus admitted, and the shame in his voice was palpable. Not at first. I was 29, the nominal heir, but without real power. My father controlled everything. When I tried to speak, they told me I didn't understand business, that I was too soft, that things had always been done this way. But now you're different. Now I'm older, stronger. 2 years ago I began implementing changes, slowly so as not to alert the board. Better hours at the Georgia factories, new equipment in North Carolina, training programs in South Carolina. But it's a slow process, Winifred, very slow. And there are days I wonder if it's enough, if I'll arrive in time, if the damage is already done. Why didn't you tell me before? Because I was afraid of losing you. Because I knew that knowing the truth would make you doubt me, doubt us. Because... His voice broke. Because I'm ashamed of what my family has done. And being ashamed of my surname is being ashamed of part of who I am. Winifred looked at him for a long time. The man in front of her wasn't the fairy tale prince she'd imagined in the happy weeks following their reunion. He was something more complex, An heir to stained privileges trying to clean decades of abuse. A man trapped between the weight of his surname and the desire to be a better person. "Take me to Alabama," she finally said. "What?" "To the factory. I want to see with my own eyes how things are now." "Winifred, I don't think—" "I'm not asking for permission," she interrupted firmly. "If we're going to continue together, I need to know the complete truth. I need to see if your words match reality." Thaddeus looked at her with something that seemed like admiration mixed with fear. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" "I'm practical," she corrected, "and I've learned that beautiful words without actions to back them up are worth nothing." 3 days later, Winifred walked through the hallways of the Ashworth factory in Alabama, disguised as a candidate for a seamstress position. Thaddeus had insisted on accompanying her, but she refused. She needed to see things without filters, without the mask they'd inevitably put on if they knew the heir was observing. What she found was a bittersweet mixture of progress and persistent problems. The facilities were newer than she expected, with modern ventilation and natural light entering through wide windows. But the workers' faces told another story. Deep fatigue, mechanical movements, whispered conversations that faded when supervisors passed nearby. She spoke with several of them during lunch break, introducing herself as a nervous applicant wanting to know the environment before accepting the job. She heard complaints about shifts extending without extra pay, about the lack of daycare for mothers, about salaries barely covering basic expenses. But she also heard hopes, rumors of changes coming from above, of an heir who supposedly cared about workers, of slow but real improvements. When she returned to Charleston that night, she carried more questions than answers. But she also carried something else, a seed of purpose beginning to germinate inside her. "I need you to let me help you," she told Thaddeus when they met at her apartment. "With the changes in the factories, not as your partner but as someone who knows from the inside what it means to work until you break." He looked at her with eyes bright with hope and fear intertwined. "Are you sure it won't be easy? My family, the board—" "Nothing in my life has been easy," Winifred responded. "I'm used to battles. The only thing I need to know is if you're willing to fight with me." Thaddeus took her calloused hands between his and brought them to his lips. "Until the end," he promised. And that night, as the full moon bathed Charleston's historic streets with silver light, two people from different worlds sealed a pact that would change not only their lives, but those of thousands of anonymous workers whose voices would finally be heard. The months that followed tested every fiber of Winifred's being. The transformation of the Ashworth factories was an exhausting process that consumed her day and night. She'd left 2 of her 3 jobs, the night cleaning and the baked goods sales, to dedicate herself completely to this new mission. Though Thaddeus insisted she didn't need to work at all, she refused to depend completely on him. Her independence was the only thing keeping her anchored to herself in the midst of the whirlwind. Meetings with the board of directors in Atlanta were battlefields where every proposal was received with resistance. Men in grey suits and calculating gazes questioned every figure, every change, every dollar invested in improving workers' conditions. "This will reduce profit margins," argued Mr. Ernest, the financial director, with a voice dripping contempt. "Shareholders won't approve." "Shareholders will survive with a little less profit," Winifred responded, standing firm. "Workers can't continue surviving with a little less health." The looks executives exchanged clearly said what they thought of that intruder, who dared speak to them as equals. But Thaddeus backed her in every confrontation, and the shadow of Mrs. Eleanor, who still held significant shares and an influence transcending numbers, silenced the most virulent protests. Victoria was the worst. Thaddeus's sister had intensified her hostility campaign, inviting Winifred to lunches, where she subtly humiliated her in front of her high society friends. "And how's my brother's charity project going?" she'd ask with false innocence. "I suppose converting an embroiderer into an executive has its folkloric charm." "It's going very well, thanks for asking," Winifred would respond, maintaining a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It turns out embroiderers know something about precise stitches. Perhaps you could learn a thing or two." But external battles were less painful than internal ones. At night, When Thaddeus slept beside her in the room they now shared at the Asheville mansion on weekends, Winifred stayed awake, staring at the ceiling decorated with centuries-old frescoes, drowning in doubts. Who was she to believe she could change a system built over generations? What was a Charleston embroiderer doing, giving orders to executives who earned in a month what she'd earned in years? What if Prudence was right? What if all this was just Thaddeus's whim that would end when he tired of playing reformer? One night, anxiety overcame her. She got up without waking Thaddeus and wandered the mansion's silent hallways until she reached the library where months ago she'd spoken with Mrs. Eleanor. She sat in the same velvet armchair and let the tears fall freely. "The walls of this house keep many secrets," a voice said from the darkness. Winifred startled. Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in a corner she hadn't seen, wrapped in a wool shawl that made her look like a benevolent ghost. "I didn't know you were here," she apologized, wiping her cheeks. "At my age, one sleeps little and remembers much." The old woman patted the seat beside her. "Come, tell me what torments you." And Winifred did. She let everything out, the doubts, the fears, the constant sensation of being an imposter in a world that wasn't hers. She spoke of the contemptuous looks, the cruel comments, the little voice in her head whispering that she wasn't enough, that she never would be. Mrs. Eleanor listened in silence until the words ran out. "When I arrived at this house 60 years ago," she finally said, "I cried every night for 6 months. I felt exactly like you feel now. An imposter, an intruder, someone who didn't belong." "And what made you change?" "Understanding that belonging isn't something others grant you, it's something you decide. You can spend your life waiting for approval from people who'll never give it to you, or you can build your own place brick by brick, until it's so solid nobody can tear it down. It sounds easier than it is." "Oh, it's not easy at all," the old woman laughed. "It's the hardest thing you'll ever do, but look at yourself. You're already doing it. Every meeting where you stand firm, every worker whose life you improve, every small victory you wrest from a system that wants to crush you. That's building your place." Winifred thought about recent weeks, about the daycare they'd finally approved for the Alabama factory, about the more humane schedules they were implementing in Georgia, about the thank you letters she received from anonymous women whose lives were changing thanks to reforms she'd pushed. "Sometimes I don't know if what I do matters," she admitted. "It always matters," Mrs. Eleanor responded firmly. "Every act of kindness, every fight for justice, every time you choose to be brave when it would be easier to give up, it matters more than you'll ever know." The old woman took her hand with fragile but surprisingly warm fingers. "You're stronger than you think, child, and you deserve all the good life is giving you. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, convince you otherwise." That night, when Winifred returned to bed beside Thaddeus, something had changed. The doubts hadn't disappeared, they probably never would completely, but alongside them was now something more solid, the certainty that she was exactly where she should be, doing exactly what she should do. And when dawn painted Asheville's sky with shades of pink and gold, she allowed herself for the first time to believe, really believe, that she deserved the happiness she was building. The change came from where she least expected it. Victoria appeared one June morning at the embroidery workshop in Charleston, where Winifred had resumed her part-time work as a way to stay connected to her roots. The doorbell chimed, and when she looked up from the embroidery frame, she almost dropped the needle in surprise. Thaddeus's sister stood in the entrance, as out of place in that modest space as a diamond in a button box. But there was something different about her. The armor of arrogance that always enveloped her seemed cracked, revealing something vulnerable beneath. "I need to talk to you," she said without preamble. Winifred looked at her co-workers, who observed the scene with wide eyes. "Give me 10 minutes, she asked them, and guided Victoria to the back room, where fabric rolls piled beside boxes of thread in every color. "I suppose you're surprised to see me here," Victoria began, crossing her arms in a defensive gesture. "You could say that." "I came to—" The woman stopped, as if the words physically cost her. "I came to apologize." The silence that followed was so dense that Winifred could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "Apologize? For how I've treated you? For the cruel comments? For trying to sabotage what you have with my brother. Winifred studied her cautiously, looking for signs of deception. But what she saw was something she didn't expect, contained tears in the eyes of that woman who had always seemed incapable of genuine emotions. Why now? Victoria dropped into a rickety chair, all her elegance abandoning her at once. Because last night I heard my father talking with the lawyers. They're planning something. Something to take control of the factories from Thaddeus. They say his reforms are harming the business, that they need someone more traditional, in command. Winifred's heart accelerated. And what do you have to do with that? They wanted me to support them, to testify that my brother that he's not in his right mind, influenced by... She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Influenced by you. And what did you tell them? Victoria raised her gaze, and for the first time Winifred saw the person behind the mask. I told them to go to hell. Why? Because... Victoria's voice broke. Because my brother is the only person in this family who's ever treated me with genuine affection. And because you've made him happier than I'd ever seen him. And because maybe, she admitted with difficulty, maybe I was jealous that someone could love like that. Without calculations, without ulterior motives. The confession floated in the air, charged with dust and memories of the small storage room. My whole life I was taught that love was a transaction, Victoria continued, that genuine feelings were weakness, that the only thing that mattered was money, status, power. And when I saw you arrive with your working hands and honest heart, I hated you. I hated you because you represented everything I'd been convinced to despise. And now? Now, I think I was a fool. Victoria laughed bitterly. A fool raised to be cruel. But I don't want to continue being one. I don't want to be like my father. Winifred breathed deeply, processing everything she heard. The woman in front of her wasn't the enemy she'd imagined. She was another victim of the same system that had tried to destroy her, only with golden chains instead of chains of necessity. What do you propose? She finally asked. An alliance. I have information, contacts, access to conversations my father doesn't know I hear. I can help you protect what you're building. In exchange, she hesitated. In exchange, I only ask for an opportunity, to be different, to prove I can be more than what I was taught to be. Winifred extended her hand. You have to understand one thing, Victoria. I don't trust you. Not yet. Trust is built with actions, not words. I know. But I'm willing to give you the opportunity you're asking for, because I believe everyone deserves the chance to change. Victoria took her hand, and the grip was firm, determined. You won't regret it. The following weeks proved she kept her word. The information she provided about Mr. Gerald's maneuvers allowed Thaddeus to anticipate every move, protect his reforms, consolidate allies on the board. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Victoria began to transform. Less arrogance, more humility, less criticism, more listening. She even began visiting the factories, getting to know workers by name, understanding that behind every figure was a human life with dreams and struggles. Mrs. Eleanor observed everything with a satisfied smile. I always knew there was something good in that girl, she told Winifred one afternoon. She just needed someone to see it like I saw it in you. I didn't do anything special, Winifred responded. I just gave her an opportunity. Sometimes, the old woman said wisely, that's all someone needs. 8 months after Beatrice's wedding, the revolution Winifred and Thaddeus had initiated was bearing fruit exceeding all expectations. The Alabama factory had become a model for the entire American textile industry. Free daycare for workers' children, flexible hours for mothers, salaries finally allowing them to live with dignity. The training programs Winifred had designed were producing specialized embroiderers earning double what they charged before, with artisanal techniques adding value to products. The business press had begun taking notice. An article in the Wall Street Journal titled, "The Rebel Heir Transforming Southern Textiles." And though Mr. Gerald still resisted tooth and nail, the numbers spoke for themselves. Sales had increased, personnel turnover had decreased, and Ashworth products were gaining international recognition for their quality and ethical practices. But for Winifred, The greatest satisfaction came from small moments, like the morning she received a letter from Mary Catherine, a seamstress from the North Carolina factory who'd been able to have back surgery thanks to the new health insurance and now taught embroidery techniques to apprentices. Or the afternoon she visited the Georgia daycare and saw workers' children playing in a bright space full of colors while their mothers worked peacefully, knowing they were well cared for. "This is what matters," she told Thaddeus as they watched the children from the window. "Not numbers on a balance sheet, not magazine covers, this." He surrounded her with his arms, resting his chin on her head. "None of this would have been possible without you." "That's not true. You already wanted to change things before meeting me." "I wanted to, but I didn't know how. You showed me the way. You reminded me that behind every machine is a person with a story, with a family, with dreams. That's something I never would have learned in board meetings." Winifred turned to look at him. "Do you regret anything?" "Only not finding you sooner." That night, while they dined at a small restaurant in Alabama frequented by port workers, Thaddeus pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I have something for you." "Another gift?" "You already know I don't need." "It's not that kind of gift," he interrupted. "Open it." Winifred tore the paper with curious fingers. Inside were legal documents she took a moment to understand, and when she did, tears began falling before she could stop them. "The embroidery workshop," she whispered. "Mrs. Constance's. Mr. Anthony, the building owner, wanted to sell when Constance retires next year. I bought the property and put it in your name. But I can't accept." "It's not charity," Thaddeus said firmly, taking her hands. "It's investment in you, in what you can build. You'll transform that place into something bigger, a fair trade embroiderers cooperative, apprentice training, dignified conditions, something that's completely yours." "Thaddeus, listen to me," he continued, his eyes shining with an intensity that left her breathless. "I don't want to be your savior. I don't want you to owe me anything. I want to be your partner, your equal. And this is just recognition of everything you already are, everything you deserve. It won't change anything between us, except giving you the freedom to fly higher." Winifred looked at the documents, then looked at Thaddeus, then looked at the documents again as if afraid they'd vanish. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." And in that modest Alabama restaurant, surrounded by the bustle of workers celebrating the end of their shift with beers and appetizers, Winifred Hayes felt for the first time that the universe was finally aligning. Not because a man had given her something, but because she'd found someone who saw everything she was capable of creating and wanted to help her make it real, not as rescuer and rescued, as equals, as partners. The extraordinary shareholders' meeting of Ashworth Textiles was convened for a Thursday in September, when summer gave its last gasps and leaves began to tinge with autumn's first golden tones. Mr. Gerald had gathered his allies for the final blow. Months of maneuvers culminated in this meeting, where he intended to remove Thaddeus from executive management, arguing loss of confidence and decisions harmful to shareholders' interests. Everyone knew that behind the corporate phrases hid a simpler truth. The father couldn't tolerate that his son was transforming the family empire according to the values of a Charleston embroiderer. The conference room in the Atlanta corporate building was full. Gray-suited executives, investment fund representatives, board members, lawyers with leather briefcases, and in the front row, Mrs. Eleanor, impeccable in her black dress and lace mantilla, with Victoria beside her showing an expression of determination nobody had seen before. Winifred observed from a discreet seat in the last row. She had no voice or vote in that meeting, but had insisted on being present. She needed to see how this battle that was also hers would end. Mr. Gerald took the floor with the confidence of someone who believes victory assured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here because the current management's decisions have put this company's financial stability at risk. Operating costs have increased, profit margins have decreased, and all to implement policies." Contemptuous pause. "Sentimental policies that have no place in serious business." Thaddeus remained silent, his face a mask of calm Winifred knew cost him to maintain. But they'd agreed on the strategy. Let Mr. Gerald speak first, expose all his cards, and then counterattack. "Therefore," Mr. Gerald continued, I propose a vote of no confidence against the current chief executive and his immediate replacement with someone with more traditional business vision. May I speak? The voice that interrupted wasn't Thaddeus's. It was Mrs. Eleanor's, who had stood with an elegance defying her 89 years. Mother, this isn't... Silence, Gerald, the old woman cut him off with an authority that silenced the entire room. I've listened to your nonsense for months without saying anything, but enough. She turned to the shareholders, sweeping them with a gaze that had seen empires born and die. Many of you don't know me. You only see an old woman who signs checks and attends charity galas, but I built this company alongside my husband from a small weaving mill to what it is today, and I won't allow you to destroy it in the name of greed. Mother, the figures speak for themselves. Figures are paper, Mrs. Eleanor responded. I'm talking about something more important, this company's soul. My grandson is doing what I always wanted to do and never dared. He's returning humanity to a business that lost it long ago. Have costs increased? Yes. Have margins temporarily dropped? Yes. But personnel turnover is at historic lows. Our product's quality has never been better, and we're gaining international recognition. Those are the foundations of a solid future, not short-term quarterly profits. That's sentimentalism, Mr. Gerald spat. It's vision, Victoria contradicted, standing beside her grandmother. And it's what this company needs to survive in a world that no longer tolerates exploitation disguised as efficiency. A murmur ran through the room. Shareholders exchanged glances, weighing positions, calculating alliances. Thaddeus finally stood. You can vote however you want, he said with a firm voice, but know this. If you remove me today, it won't be the end of reforms. It'll be the beginning of a public scandal when I reveal the real conditions of our factories before we started the changes. I have documentation, testimonies, proof, and I have the determination to use all of it if necessary. Are you threatening us? Mr. Gerald's voice trembled with contained fury. I'm offering you a choice, Father. We can move forward together, building a company we can all be proud of, or we can destroy each other publicly. The decision is yours. The silence that followed was the longest of Winifred's life. From her seat in the last row, she could see the battle unfolding on Mr. Gerald's face, pride against pragmatism, stubbornness against survival. Finally, the old man spoke. I withdraw the motion. Murmurs exploded into open conversations. Thaddeus briefly closed his eyes, letting out a sigh of relief only Winifred could perceive. Mrs. Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of a general who'd won her last great battle. When the meeting ended and attendees began dispersing, Winifred made her way through the crowd until reaching Thaddeus. He saw her approaching and, without caring about the hundreds of eyes watching them, took her in his arms. We did it, he whispered against her hair. You did it, she corrected. No, he responded, separating to look in her eyes. None of this would have been possible without you. You gave me the courage to be who I want to be. You showed me there was another way. You're my compass, Winifred, and if you'll let me, I want you to be that forever. He pulled a small box from his pocket. Inside, a simple but beautiful ring, silver with a sapphire blue stone, the exact color of the dress she wore the night they met. I can't promise you a life without battles, Thaddeus said. I can't promise you my family will stop being difficult or the road will be easy, but I can promise you I'll never stop fighting by your side. Would you do me the honor of marrying me? Tears fell down Winifred's cheeks as she nodded, unable to form words. And when he slid the ring on her finger, the applause that erupted around them from Mrs. Eleanor, from Victoria, from executives who'd witnessed everything, was just background noise compared to the beating of two hearts that had finally found their home in each other. 1 year later, the Charleston Hands Embroidery Cooperative now occupied the entire Church Street building, with 3 floors of bright workshops where dozens of women created works of art with thread and needle. Windows let in the golden light of the low-country afternoon, illuminating fabrics of every color, embroidery frames of different sizes, and faces concentrated on their work. Winifred walked among the tables, stopping here and there to praise work well done, gently correct a technique, listen to her workers' stories. Many of them had come from the Ashworth factories, attracted by the promise of dignified conditions and the opportunity to specialize in a craft threatening to be lost. Others were young people who'd never touched a needle, eager apprentices wanting to master an art, connecting with past generations. Mrs. Constance still came every morning, though no longer to work but to sit by the window and supervise with a critical eye, but increasingly approving, the evolution of what had been her small workshop. Dorothy and Pearl had been promoted to master embroiderers, transmitting their knowledge to new generations. And Hope, the young woman who years ago stifled giggles when Thaddeus appeared with his transparent excuses, now directed the training program with an efficiency surprising everyone. "Winifred, this arrived for you," Beatrice called from the entrance, waving an envelope. Winifred approached, wiping her hands on the apron she still wore, though she no longer needed to. The envelope contained an elegant invitation. The Southern Textile Entrepreneurs Association was honoring her as Innovator of the Year for her work transforming the sector's labor practices. She smiled, storing the invitation in her pocket. A year ago, something like this would have paralyzed her with fear and insecurity. Now she saw it for what it was, a deserved recognition, not for being Thaddeus Ashworth's wife, but for her own work, her own ideas, her own hands that kept embroidering stories of change in every life they touched. Because yes, she was Thaddeus's wife. The wedding had been 6 months ago, an intimate ceremony in the Asheville Mansion Gardens, with Mrs. Eleanor as matron of honor and Victoria, transformed into a genuine ally, as bridesmaid. Mr. Gerald hadn't attended, but his absence weighed less than Winifred expected. Love doesn't need the approval of those who choose not to understand it. Thaddeus appeared through the back door, with grease stains on his hands and a mischievous boy's smile. He'd spent the morning in the antique machinery restoration workshops the cooperative maintained, recovering 19th-century looms now producing artisanal fabrics of incalculable value. "I was looking for you," he said, approaching to kiss her forehead. "Your mother called. She wants you to visit this weekend. She says she has something important to tell you." Winifred's heart accelerated. Visits to the Columbia nursing home were bittersweet. Her mother had good days and bad days, moments of lucidity shining like diamonds among dementia's fog. But every conversation, every instant of recognition, was a treasure she fiercely cherished. "We'll go together," she said, taking his hand. "Always." That night, after closing the cooperative and saying goodbye to the last embroiderers, Winifred walked with Thaddeus through Charleston's historic streets, holding hands as they did in those first months of secret romance. The ancient stones gleamed wet from recent rain, and the scent of jasmine mixed with incense escaping from the nearby church. They stopped in the same place where they'd kissed for the first time, in front of the illuminated church facade that had been silent witness to so many love stories throughout the centuries. "Do you remember?" he asked. "Every detail," she responded. "Who would have said we'd end up here?" Winifred looked at their intertwined hands, his, which had learned to get dirty with honest work, hers, still calloused, still marked by years of struggle, but now adorned with a ring symbolizing promises kept and others to come. "Not me," she admitted. "That night at the wedding, when we danced together, I thought you were just a beautiful dream that would disappear at dawn. I didn't believe I deserved something like this." And now? Winifred thought about everything she'd lived in the last year, the battles won and the scars they left, the alliances forged with enemies who became friends, the thousands of lives transformed by reforms she'd pushed with her own hands, the grandmother who'd welcomed her like a granddaughter, the mother who, in her lucid moments, cried with pride hearing about her achievements, the love that had grown not despite obstacles, but strengthened by them. "Now I know I deserved this all along," she finally said. "I just needed someone to remind me until I could believe it myself." Thaddeus kissed her under Charleston's stars, soft and deep, like a renewed promise. "I love you, Winifred Hayes Ashworth, and I love you, until the end." As they walked back home, because now they had a home together, a home built brick by brick with love and determination, Winifred thought about the sapphire blue dress still hanging in her closet, a reminder that sometimes Life's most transformative moments arrive barefoot, disguised as chance. It had begun as a casual dance at someone else's wedding. It had ended as the most beautiful love story she could imagine, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, built on foundations of honesty, respect, and the unshakable certainty that they both deserved to be happy. Arriving home, Winifred stopped at the threshold and looked back, toward the historic streets that had witnessed her transformation. From the exhausted embroiderer, who didn't believe she deserved anything, to the woman she now was. Entrepreneur, reformer, wife, and above all, someone who'd finally learned to love herself. The night wind brought the scent of orange blossoms and infinite possibilities. "Are you coming?" Thaddeus asked from inside. Winifred smiled, crossing the threshold into her new life. Always. Because some stories don't end with, "and they lived happily ever after." They end with something better, with two people who choose every day to build their own happiness together.